A doctor fights to save a dying man on the operating table, pushing past exhaustion, knowing this is just another routine case. Until it isn't. When the patient pulls through, the doctor steps into the recovery room and freezes. A rare birthmark on the young man's collarbone stops him cold. It's impossible. Because he's seen that birthmark before, on the infant son he abandoned 28 years ago. How did his son end up homeless, bleeding out in a dark alley? And when the truth comes out, will it bring them closer, or shatter both of their lives forever? Stay tuned for this heart-wrenching story of family, regret, and a second chance that may come too late. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The emergency room doors burst open as the paramedics rushed in with their critical patient. Blood soaked through the white sheets, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the pristine hospital floor. Dr. Richard Monroe's trained eyes quickly assessed the situation as the young man was wheeled past him, his decades of experience already cataloging the severity of the injuries. Male, early 20s, multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen, the paramedic reported breathlessly, wiping sweat from his brow. Found unconscious in an alley off 23rd Street. BP's dropping fast, lost consciousness about 10 minutes ago. Richard fell into step beside the gurney, his mind already mapping out the necessary procedures, calculating odds and survival rates with practiced precision. "Get him to OR3, he commanded, his voice steady and authoritative, the same tone that had guided countless emergency surgeries before. "Page Dr. Carter and prep for immediate surgery. Have 4 units of O-negative ready." The operating room buzzed with controlled chaos as nurses and technicians moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role in this life-saving dance. Dr. Emily Carter arrived moments later, her face set with determination as she joined Richard at the operating table, pulling on her surgical gloves with swift, practiced movements. "He's crashing!" Nurse Julia Thompson called out as the monitors screamed their warning. The young man's blood pressure was plummeting dangerously low, the numbers flashing an angry red on the screen above. Richard's hands moved with precision as he made the first incision, the scalpel steady in his grip. "More suction here," he ordered, his eyes fixed on the damage before him, searching for the source of the bleeding. "Carter, clamp that bleeder, we need better visualization." Emily worked quickly, her movements matching Richard's rhythm like a well-rehearsed symphony. "There's extensive damage to the liver," she reported, her voice tense but controlled. "Multiple lacerations, possible portal vein involvement." Hours ticked by as Richard methodically repaired torn vessels and damaged organs, each stitch placed with meticulous care. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temples, but his concentration never wavered. The young man's heart stopped twice during the surgery, each time brought back by the team's swift response and Richard's skilled hands, the defibrillator leaving angry red marks on the pale chest. "Come on, kid," Julia murmured, her eyes fixed on the monitors, her hands steady as she passed instruments. "Stay with us. You're stronger than this." Richard's world narrowed to the task before him, each suture, each repair a step toward saving this nameless young man's life. He worked with mechanical precision, his emotions locked away behind years of professional detachment, the way he'd learned to survive in this high-stakes environment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last suture was placed. The monitors showed stable vital signs, and a collective sigh of relief filled the room, the tension draining from shoulders and faces. "Good work, everyone," Richard said, stepping back from the table, his surgical gown spotted with blood. He pulled off his bloody gloves with a snap, already mentally filing this away as another successful surgery in a career full of them. Another life saved through skill and science. Emily watched him closely, noting the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his exhaustion. "That was incredible, Dr. Monroe. The way you handled the arterial repair." She shook her head in admiration, knowing few surgeons could have achieved the same result. "Just doing my job," Richard replied simply, his mind already moving on to his next case, compartmentalizing as he always did. Hours later, after completing his rounds, Richard entered the recovery room to check on his patient. The young man lay still, his chest rising and falling steadily under the thin hospital gown, tubes and wires monitoring every vital sign. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows across his pale face, making him look even younger than he probably was, almost boyish in his unconscious state. Richard approached the bed, reaching for the chart at its foot. He needed to check the post-op vitals, ensure everything was progressing as expected. With practiced efficiency, he pulled back the hospital gown to examine the surgical site, his movements automatic after thousands of similar checks. That's when he saw it. There, on the young man's collarbone, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark, like a tiny moon etched into the skin. Richard's hand froze mid-motion, his mind suddenly unable to process what he was seeing. The birthmark, that distinctive curve he had last seen 23 years ago on his infant son's skin, was unmistakable, a mark he'd traced with his finger the day his son was born. The chart slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed in the quiet room, but Richard barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on that small mark, his carefully maintained professional detachment crumbling as memories flooded back, washing away decades of practiced stoicism. The steady beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder, matching the thundering of his own heart. Richard Monroe, who prided himself on his emotional control, felt his world tilt on its axis as he stared at the unconscious face of what could only be his long-lost son. The child he'd walked away from all those years ago now lying before him, brought by fate or chance to his operating table. The harsh fluorescent lights in the hallway had dimmed to their night setting, casting long shadows across Richard's office. His hands trembled as he opened the manila folder containing Ryan's medical records, the paper rough against his fingertips. Each page turn felt like lifting a weight, revealing more pieces of a puzzle he'd tried to forget for nearly 3 decades. Date of birth, March 15, 1995, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper, cracking slightly on the last digit. The numbers matched perfectly, the same day his son had been born. His eyes scanned further down the page, heart pounding. Birthplace, St. Mary's Hospital, Portland. Another match. Richard leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his graying hair. The weight of reality pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The leather of his expensive office chair creaked beneath him as he shifted uncomfortably. He remembered that day with painful clarity, the cry of a newborn, Sarah's exhausted smile, the smell of hospital antiseptic, and his own cowardice disguised as ambition. The next set of documents detailed Ryan's journey through the foster care system. Page after page documented transfers between homes, school changes, and behavioral incidents. Each new entry made Richard's stomach churn as he read the clinical descriptions of his son's troubled childhood, written in detached bureaucratic language that reduced a boy's pain to mere statistics. Multiple placement attempts unsuccessful, difficulty bonding with foster families, frequent episodes of running away. The words blurred as tears threatened to form in his eyes. A drop of moisture landed on the page, smudging the ink slightly. He blinked them back, maintaining the emotional control he'd perfected over years of medical practice, though his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The most recent records painted an even grimmer picture. No permanent address, no emergency contacts, no family members listed. The space where loved ones should be named remained stubbornly blank, a void that screamed louder than any written word. His son had become a ghost in the system, existing on the fringes of society, invisible to all but the most observant. Richard's mind wandered back to that pivotal moment 28 years ago. He'd been young, ambitious, fresh out of medical school with dreams of becoming a top surgeon. His stethoscope had felt like a badge of honor around his neck. A baby hadn't fit into those plans. Sarah had begged him to stay, to be a father, her eyes red with tears, but he'd convinced himself that leaving was the right choice. His career would provide better opportunities for everyone, or so he'd told himself. God, what have I done? He whispered, clutching his head in his hands, his wedding ring catching the dim light. The pristine office, the awards on his walls, the prestigious position he'd achieved. It all felt hollow now, like props in a play about success. His success had come at an unthinkable price. His son living on the streets, fighting for survival while he performed surgeries in this gleaming hospital. A photo slipped from between the pages, a mugshot from a minor offense 2 years ago. Richard picked it up with unsteady fingers, careful not to bend the corners. The young man in the photo stared back defiantly, his eyes hard and guarded, wearing a threadbare t-shirt. But beneath that hardness, Richard could see Sarah's features, the same determined jaw, the same subtle arch of the eyebrows, even the same tiny scar above his right eye. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick and stifling. Richard stood up and paced, his footsteps echoing in the empty office. The sound of a distant siren filtered through the window, a reminder of the dangerous world his son had been forced to navigate alone. The medical file lay open on his desk, each page a testament to his failures as a father. His carefully constructed world of surgical precision and emotional distance was crumbling around him like a house of cards. He stopped at his office window, staring out at the city lights below, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Somewhere out there, his son had been living on these streets, alone and abandoned, while he'd built his career just miles away. The irony was unbearable, that it would take a near-fatal stabbing to bring them back together, as if fate had finally decided to intervene. Richard returned to his desk, sinking heavily into his chair. The black and white hospital records stared back at him, stark and accusing in their simplicity. Coffee had gone cold in his favorite ceramic mug, untouched and forgotten. How could he possibly face Ryan now? What could he say to justify 28 years of absence? The ticking of his office clock seemed to mock him, counting down to a confrontation he both dreaded and desperately needed. The morning sun crept through Richard's living room windows, painting golden stripes across his hardwood floor. He sat perched on the edge of his leather couch, his normally pristine appearance disheveled after a sleepless night. His dress shirt was wrinkled and dark circles shadowed his eyes. A half-empty cup of cold coffee sat untouched on the glass table before him, testament to his distracted state. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo in the quiet room, each second pulling him deeper into memories he'd locked away for nearly 30 years. The familiar scent of his leather furniture and expensive cologne felt suddenly suffocating. Suddenly, he wasn't sitting in his expensive home anymore. He was back in that tiny apartment, the paint peeling off the walls, facing a tearful Anna Dawson. The musty smell of old carpet and cheap air freshener filled his nostrils. "Please, Richard." Anna's voice cracked as she stood in her small kitchen. Her waitress uniform was wrinkled, and her eyes were red from crying. A stack of unpaid bills lay scattered across the chipped Formica counter behind her. "I can't do this alone. I can barely make rent as it is." The younger version of Richard stood stiffly by the door, his medical textbooks clutched to his chest like a shield. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes spotlessly polished. A stark contrast to the shabby apartment. "I have 3 more years of medical school, Anna. Then residency. I can't be a father right now." "But I'm scared," Anna whispered, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Her fingers trembled against the worn fabric of her uniform. "We could figure something out. Maybe if we both worked extra shifts." "There is no we, Anna," young Richard cut her off coldly. His fingers dug into the leather binding of his textbooks. "I have a plan for my life. A baby would ruin everything I've worked for." Tears streamed down Anna's face, catching the dim light from the flickering fluorescent bulb above. "What about what I've worked for? What about our baby's future?" "Maybe." Young Richard hesitated, his voice clinical and detached, like he was discussing a case study rather than their child. "Maybe adoption would be the best option. The baby could have a better life with a real family." The memory of Anna's devastated expression hit present-day Richard like a physical blow. He lurched forward on the couch, running his hands through his gray-streaked hair. The morning light seemed to mock him with its cheerfulness. That baby was now lying in his hospital's recovery room, a homeless man who'd nearly died from a stabbing. No better life, no real family, just abandonment and struggle. The irony of saving his son's life without even knowing it twisted like a knife in his gut. Richard's chest tightened as another memory surfaced. The last time he'd seen Anna, she was signing adoption papers at the agency, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. He'd stood in the corner, refusing to look at the baby carrier where his newborn son slept, trying to block out the soft sounds of infant breathing. "I'm doing this because I love him," Anna had whispered, more to herself than to Richard. Her tears fell onto the papers, smudging the ink. "He deserves better than what I can give him." Richard had simply walked away that day, burying himself in his studies, in his career, in the precise, controlled world of surgery where emotions had no place. He'd convinced himself he'd made the right choice, that somewhere his son was living a happy life with loving parents. Each achievement, each accolade had been another brick in the wall he'd built around his guilt. But now the truth sat like lead in his stomach. There had been no loving family, no better life, just a series of foster homes that had eventually led Ryan to the streets. The weight of 3 decades of willful ignorance pressed down on his shoulders. Richard stood up abruptly, pacing across his living room. The morning light caught the frame of his medical degree hanging on the wall, the degree he'd prioritized over everything else, over everyone else. The gold lettering seemed to mock him now, a symbol of everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost. He stopped at his window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, Anna might still be alive, carrying the weight of their decision. And in his hospital, their son lay recovering, not knowing that the surgeon who saved his life was the same man who had abandoned him before he'd taken his first breath. The city sprawled before him, indifferent to his personal tragedy, its streets filled with people starting their day. Richard made a silent vow, his jaw set with determination. He wouldn't walk away this time. But the question that haunted him was, how do you reconnect with a son you abandoned decades ago? The answer seemed as distant as the horizon, but for the first time in 30 years he was ready to try. The steady beep of the heart monitor suddenly spiked as Ryan's eyes flew open. His chest heaved with panicked breaths as he jerked upright, immediately doubling over from the stabbing pain in his side. The stark white hospital room spun around him as his hands clutched at the bandages wrapped around his torso, his fingers tracing the rough edges of the gauze beneath his thin hospital gown. Where am I?" His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, scratchy and raw like he'd been screaming. The last thing he remembered was the cold alley, the flash of a knife, and then darkness, complete and terrifying darkness that had swallowed him whole. Nurse Julia Thompson rushed into the room, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. Her soft-soled shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor as she approached. "Mr. Dawson, you're at Metropolitan Hospital. You need to lie back down. You've just had major surgery." Ryan's face twisted with anger, the monitors beeping, growing faster with his rising pulse. No hospitals." His fingers fumbled with the IV in his arm, shaking with a mixture of fury and weakness. "I can't afford this. I'm not staying here." "Please, you need to calm down," Julia said, reaching for his arm with gentle but firm hands. "You've lost a lot of blood." "Don't touch me." Ryan yanked the IV out, causing blood to trickle down his arm in thin crimson streams. His eyes were wild, like a trapped animal's, darting between Julia and the door. "I'm leaving. Now." The door opened again and Dr. Richard Monroe stepped in, his heart pounding at the sight of his son awake for the first time. His carefully maintained professional mask couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Dr. Monroe. I performed your surgery last night. You had multiple stab wounds that caused internal bleeding. You need to stay." "I don't care what you did," Ryan snarled, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His face was pale and sweaty from the effort, the hospital gown clinging to his clammy skin. "I didn't ask for your help, and I'm not paying for it." Richard took a careful step forward, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. His fingers twitched with the urge to reach out to his son. "The cost isn't important right now. What's important is that you don't tear your stitches." "Back off!" Ryan's voice cracked with fury, the words echoing off the sterile walls. "You doctors are all the same. Act like you care, Then send the bills that destroy people's lives. I know how this works. Julia pressed the call button for security, but Richard held up his hand, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. That won't be necessary. He kept his eyes on Ryan, seeing past the anger to the deep pain beneath. Pain he knew he'd helped create 23 years ago. No one is forcing you to stay, but you nearly died last night. At least let us check your vitals before you make any decisions. Ryan's jaw clenched as he glared at Richard, his hands gripping the bed rails so tight his knuckles turned white. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he spoke through gritted teeth, his voice dripping with contempt. I don't trust doctors, and I sure as hell don't trust you. The evening shadows stretched across the hospital room as Richard entered, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor. The antiseptic smell hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of where they were. Ryan sat rigidly in bed, arms crossed tightly over his chest, the thin blanket bunched around his waist. His dark eyes followed Richard's every move with the wariness of a cornered animal, tracking each step like someone who'd learned the hard way to never let down his guard. Richard pulled up a chair, its legs scraping softly against the linoleum. He kept his movements deliberate and calm, like approaching a frightened patient, careful not to make any sudden gestures. You must be tired of doctors by now, he said, trying to sound casual despite the tension knotting his shoulders. Ryan scoffed, his lip curling into a familiar sneer. You think? The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Richard noticed the way Ryan's hospital gown hung loose on his frame, revealing collarbones that jutted out too sharply. Old bruises dotted his arms in various shades of yellow and purple, telling stories of street fights and hard nights. A fresh scratch marked his left cheek, still angry and red. The surgery went well. Richard started, falling back on the comfort of medical facts. Your recovery should be... Save the doctor speech, Ryan cut in, his fingers digging into his arms. I don't need your fake concern. Richard leaned back, studying the young man before him. Everything about Ryan screamed defiance, from his clenched jaw to his rigid posture, to the way his fingers drummed restlessly against his arm. His eyes caught the gleam of Richard's watch, and his expression darkened further, something bitter and knowing crossing his face. That thing could probably feed me for 6 months, Ryan said, nodding at the watch, his voice heavy with accusation. Richard resisted the urge to hide it, to tuck his hand beneath the chair. You're not just another case to me, Ryan. Don't call me that, Ryan snapped, his voice sharp as broken glass, his shoulders hunching forward defensively. You don't know me. Nurse Julia Thompson stood quietly by the door, her clipboard clutched to her chest, watching the exchange with concern. The tension in the room was palpable as Ryan's hostility grew with each passing moment, filling the small space like a gathering storm. Look, Ryan continued, his words dripping with bitterness, each one carefully chosen to wound. I know your type. Rich doctor, fancy watch, probably live in some big house with a perfect lawn. You look at people like me and think we're just problems to fix, makes you feel good about yourself, right? Richard felt each word like a physical blow, each accusation striking uncomfortably close to home. That's not true. I genuinely want to help. Help? Ryan laughed, but there was no humor in it, just raw pain wrapped in anger. Where were people like you when I was sleeping in doorways, when I was getting beaten up in foster homes, when I was eating from dumpsters? Before Richard could respond, Ryan reached for his IV, yanking it out with a swift motion that spoke of previous experience. The heart monitor began blaring its warning, its shrill beeps echoing off the walls. I'm done here, he growled, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his movements sharp with determination. Nurse Thompson rushed forward as other nurses appeared in the doorway, their shoes squeaking against the floor. Someone called for security, their voice urgent and professional. Richard stood, feeling helpless as he watched his son prepare to flee, knowing any move to stop him would only make things worse. You want to throw your life away? Fine, he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth even as he regretted them. Ryan stormed past him, pushing through the gathering crowd of hospital staff, his hospital gown fluttering behind him. His bare feet slapped against the cold floor as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Richard standing alone in the chaos of beeping machines and concerned voices, the weight of another failure settling heavy on his shoulders. Richard slumped in his office chair, the morning sun casting long shadows across his desk. Ryan's discharge papers lay before him, a stark reminder of his failure. His fingers traced the hastily scrawled signature at the bottom, just an angry scribble, a final act of defiance before Ryan had stormed out, leaving behind only the echo of slamming doors and bitter words. "I can't let this end here," he muttered, running a tired hand over his face. The weight of 28 years of absence pressed down on him, making each breath feel heavy, each moment a reminder of time lost forever. He picked up his phone, dialing hospital security. Did anyone see which way the patient from room 412 went? The answer was no. Of course not. Ryan knew how to disappear. He'd probably been doing it his whole life, perfecting the art of becoming invisible when the world got too hard. Richard pulled up every record he could find: old hospital visits, police reports, shelter registrations. Each document painted a clearer picture of a life lived in shadows, of someone who'd learned to survive by staying invisible. The scattered trail of paperwork told a story of bruises, broken bones, and nights spent in cold doorways. Hours later, he found himself driving through the city's forgotten corners. His expensive car drew suspicious looks as he crawled past homeless shelters and soup kitchens, places he'd only read about in charity reports. Each face he saw made his heart jump, but none belonged to Ryan. The growing desperation in his chest made every passing minute feel like an eternity. The sun was setting when he turned into a neighborhood where broken windows outnumbered intact ones. Graffiti covered nearly every surface, and small groups of people huddled in doorways, watching his car with wary eyes. The smell of garbage and despair hung thick in the air. That's when he saw it: movement in an alley. 3 figures locked in a violent dance. Richard's heart stopped as he recognized Ryan's lean frame, desperately fighting off 2 larger men. Blood trickled down Ryan's face from a cut above his eye, his movements already showing signs of fatigue. His fists were up, but his stance was wobbly, betraying his weakened state. Richard slammed his car into park and jumped out, his dress shoes hitting broken concrete. "Hey, get off him!" he shouted, running toward the fight. His voice echoed off the brick walls, momentarily freezing the scene. The sound of his expensive shoes on broken glass seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Ryan's head snapped toward him, fury blazing in his eyes despite his obvious pain. "I don't need your damn help," he snarled, but the words came out weak, breathless. His attempt at defiance was betrayed by the tremor in his voice. Then Richard saw it, a dark stain spreading across Ryan's shirt. The stitches had torn open. Ryan's face went pale, his legs buckling beneath him. He slumped against the dirty alley wall, leaving a smear of red as he slid down, his tough facade crumbling with each inch he fell. Richard lunged forward, catching Ryan just before he hit the ground. The 2 attackers, seeing Ryan's condition and perhaps sensing more trouble than they'd bargained for, melted back into the shadows of the alley, their footsteps fading into the urban darkness. Ryan's body felt light in Richard's arms, too light for a man his age. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining Richard's hands. All of Richard's medical training kicked in, but this time the panic felt different. This wasn't just another patient. This was his son, bleeding out in a filthy alley because of his stubborn pride. Both of theirs. The irony of finding him only to lose him again wasn't lost on Richard as he cradled his boy's broken body. The ambulance's interior lights cast harsh shadows across Ryan's pale face as he slumped against the vehicle's wall, one hand pressed firmly against his bleeding side. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his already dirty shirt a darker shade of red. The metallic smell of blood filled the confined space, mixing with the sharp scent of antiseptic. "Let the doctors help you," Richard said, his voice tight with concern. He reached for the medical supplies, but Ryan jerked away, wincing at the sudden movement. "No!" The word came out as a growl. Ryan's eyes narrowed with stubborn determination. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the fluorescent lights. "You're being ridiculous," Richard snapped, his professional composure cracking. "That wound needs immediate attention. You've torn your stitches, and you're losing blood fast." His trained eye could see the growing pallor in Ryan's face, the slight tremor in his hands. Ryan let out a bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Why do you even care? Just another homeless guy, right? One less problem on the streets." His fingers dug deeper into his side, as if trying to physically hold himself together. Richard's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't about that. This is about you bleeding out because you're too proud to accept help." The words echoed in the cramped space of the ambulance, bouncing off the metal walls. "Proud." Ryan's voice rose, though it was weaker than before. "You don't know anything about pride. You don't know anything about me." He tried to stand, using the ambulance wall for support. "I've survived worse than this on my own." His legs shook with the effort, leaving sweaty handprints on the wall. "You don't have to, though," Richard insisted, watching Ryan's movements become more unsteady. "Please, just let us help you." He could see the boy's resolve wavering, like a candle flame in the wind. "Us?" Ryan sneered, but his face had grown even paler. "There is no us. There's you, the rich doctor in his expensive suit, and there's me, the street rat you want to fix to make yourself feel better." He swayed slightly. "I don't need your pity." His words slurred together, each one seeming to drain more energy from him. "This isn't pity." Richard moved closer, seeing Ryan's eyes starting to glaze over. "This is about saving your life." The monitor behind them began beeping more rapidly, a warning rhythm that made Richard's heart race. Ryan tried to push him away, but his strength was fading. "I said, no." His words slurred, and suddenly his knees buckled. Richard lunged forward, catching Ryan before he hit the ground. Blood was everywhere now, warm and sticky against Richard's hands, seeping into his expensive suit. "I need help out here," he shouted toward the hospital entrance. "Now." Ryan's head lolled against Richard's shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes fluttered, fighting to stay conscious. "Let me." "I'm not letting you die," Richard said firmly, holding his son's limp body close. "Not again." He looked up to see the emergency team rushing toward them with a gurney. "Stay with me, Ryan. Just stay with me." His voice cracked on the last words. The paramedics reached them, their movements quick and efficient as they lifted Ryan onto the gurney. Richard never let go of Ryan's hand as they rushed him back into the hospital, knowing every second counted now. Blood dripped onto the pavement, marking their path like breadcrumbs as they raced toward the emergency entrance, wheels clattering against the concrete. "BP's dropping," one of the paramedics called out. "We need to get him into surgery now." The urgency in her voice made Richard's stomach clench. Richard watched as Ryan's face grew more ashen, his hand becoming colder in Richard's grip. 28 years ago, he'd walked away from this boy without a second thought. Now, he couldn't take his eyes off him. Couldn't let go. He wouldn't fail him, not this time. The weight of those lost years pressed down on him like a physical thing. They burst through the emergency doors, the familiar controlled chaos of the hospital surrounding them. The sharp scent of disinfectant and the squeak of rubber-soled shoes against linoleum filled the air. Richard knew he needed to step back, let his team take over, but something kept him rooted to Ryan's side. Only when they reached the surgery prep area did he finally release Ryan's hand, watching as they wheeled him through the double doors toward the operating room. The doors swung shut with a final thud, leaving Richard alone with the echo of his son's labored breathing still ringing in his ears. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Ryan's eyes fluttered open. His head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and a dull throb pulsed through his side where the new stitches pulled at his skin. He blinked slowly, trying to clear his vision, his mouth dry and tasting of stale medicine. The familiar sterile smell of hospital disinfectant filled his nostrils. Great. Back here again. His fingers clutched at the thin hospital blanket as consciousness fully returned, the scratchy fabric rough against his calloused hands. That's when he noticed him. Richard sat in the chair beside the bed, arms crossed over his chest, watching Ryan with an unreadable expression. The doctor's usually pristine white coat was wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't left all night. His tie hung loose around his neck, and an empty coffee cup sat on the nearby table. Ryan let out a groan, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. "Don't you have other patients to bother?" The words came out raspy, his throat raw. Richard didn't respond. He just sat there, quiet and still, studying Ryan with those penetrating eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, broken only by the steady rhythm of medical equipment. The quiet made Ryan's skin crawl. He was used to people lecturing him, telling him what to do, trying to fix him. But this silent watching was worse. It made him feel exposed, vulnerable, like a bug under a microscope being examined from every angle. "What's your problem?" Ryan snapped, his voice rough. "You got something to say, just say it." His fingers twisted nervously in the blanket, betraying his discomfort. Still, Richard remained quiet, his face a mask of calm that only served to irritate Ryan further. The beeping of the heart monitor picked up slightly, matching Ryan's growing agitation, its steady rhythm becoming more insistent. "You think you've got me all figured out, huh?" Ryan's words came out bitter and sharp. Poor homeless kid, too stupid to take care of himself, living on the streets because he's too proud to accept help. He let out a harsh laugh that made his side ache. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Richard finally moved, uncrossing his arms and leaning forward slightly in his chair. His voice came out soft, but firm. "You're wrong." The words carried a weight that filled the small hospital room. Something in Richard's tone made Ryan's next angry words die in his throat. There was a weight to those two simple words, an intensity that caught him off guard. It wasn't pity in Richard's eyes. It was something else, something Ryan couldn't quite name, something that looked almost like understanding. The moment stretched between them, thick with tension. Ryan felt something shift in the air, like the ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable. He turned his head away, unable to hold Richard's gaze any longer, but he could still feel the doctor's presence beside him, as solid and unmovable as a mountain. Usually this was the part where people gave up, where they walked away, frustrated by his attitude, his resistance, his anger. Ryan waited for the sound of chair legs scraping against the floor, for footsteps heading toward the door, for the familiar sensation of being left behind yet again. But Richard didn't move. He stayed right there, a steady presence in the quiet room, his breathing calm and even in the stillness. And for the first time in as long as Ryan could remember, the crushing weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion felt just a little bit lighter, like a tiny crack had formed in the walls he'd built around himself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital room window as Nurse Thompson carefully removed the IV from Ryan's arm. He sat perched on the edge of the bed, his jaw set in a hard line, wearing the same worn clothes he'd arrived in. The fabric still carried traces of dried blood, a stark reminder of the fight that had brought him back here. The hospital gown lay discarded on the bed behind him, crumpled and forgotten. Richard stood by the door, his posture tense as he watched the discharge process. His fingers drummed an anxious rhythm against his thigh. "You could stay until you're stronger," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though concern flickered in his eyes. Ryan's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I've survived worse." His fingers absently picked at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve, unraveling it further with each nervous tug. Nurse Thompson finished her work and handed Ryan a stack of papers, the crisp forms a stark contrast to his disheveled appearance. "These are your discharge forms. Please sign where indicated." Her voice was professional but kind, and she gave him an encouraging smile. Ryan scrawled his signature without reading the documents, his movements quick and impatient. The pen scratched loudly against the paper in the quiet room. Richard took a step forward, clearing his throat. "I can arrange a temporary place for you, just until you're back on your feet." "No." Ryan's response was immediate and sharp, like a door slamming shut. He stuffed his few belongings into a plastic hospital bag, just his wallet and a worn paperback book they'd found in his jacket pocket, its pages dog-eared and water-stained. The tension in the room grew thicker as Richard watched Ryan prepare to leave. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, struggling with the urge to intervene. Ryan's movements were still stiff, his face occasionally tightening with pain as he moved, each wince making Richard's jaw clench harder. "You're wasting your time," Ryan muttered under his breath, glancing sideways at Richard as if testing his reaction. A muscle twitched in his cheek as he spoke. For once, Richard didn't argue or try to convince him otherwise. He simply stood there, watching, as Ryan shouldered his meager belongings, the plastic bag crinkling softly with each movement. Ryan pushed past him toward the door, his steps measured and careful despite his attempt to appear strong. The lingering effects of his injuries were visible in the slight hunch of his shoulders and the way he favored his left side. The antiseptic hospital smell clung to his clothes, mixing with the metallic scent of old blood. Richard followed at a distance as Ryan made his way through the hospital corridors. Other patients and staff moved around them, but the two men remained locked in their own bubble of tension. Their footsteps echoed against the polished floors, a rhythmic reminder of their separation. At the hospital entrance, Ryan pushed through the automatic doors into the cold evening air. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, the material doing little to ward off the chill. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Without a backward glance, he started walking, his figure growing smaller as he merged with the crowd on the street. Richard stood in the doorway, watching his son disappear into the gathering dusk. His heart sank as Ryan vanished from view, swallowed up by the city that had already claimed so many years of his life. The automatic doors kept opening and closing behind him, letting in bursts of cold air that he barely noticed. The morning air bit through Ryan's thin jacket as he huddled against the brick wall, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. The alley reeked of rotting garbage and stale urine, but it was familiar. This was his world. His stitches pulled uncomfortably as he shifted position, trying to find relief on the cold concrete that seemed to leach warmth straight from his bones. Two men stumbled nearby, their voices rising as they fought over a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. "It's mine, Jerry! I found it!" One of them lunged forward, nearly tripping over a pile of cardboard boxes. His dirty coat flapped open, revealing more layers of ragged clothes beneath. Ryan watched them through narrowed eyes, staying perfectly still. He knew better than to draw attention to himself in situations like this. A few feet away, an elderly woman with matted gray hair dug through a dumpster, muttering to herself as she sorted through yesterday's trash. The sound of glass bottles clinking together echoed off the walls as she worked, her gnarled fingers moving with surprising speed and purpose. Ryan's stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since leaving the hospital. The thought of the hospital made his jaw clench and his fists ball up tight. That doctor, Richard, with his expensive watch and pristine clothes pretending to care. Those concerned looks and gentle words were just an act. Ryan had seen enough fake sympathy in his life to last forever, and he wasn't about to fall for it now. A block away, Richard sat in his Mercedes gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white as he watched his son through the morning haze. His heart ached as Ryan approached a cafe's back door, waiting until the worker dumped out the day-old pastries. But before Ryan could reach the bag, another homeless man snatched it and ran, disappearing around the corner with his prize. Ryan's shoulders slumped for just a moment before his walls went back up, his face hardening into its usual mask of indifference. He tried the shelter down the street, but a sign in the window read, "Full," in bold red letters. The soup kitchen wouldn't open for hours, and the morning stretched endlessly ahead. Richard couldn't take it anymore. He drove to a food truck parked on the corner, ordering several breakfast burritos and hot coffee. His hands shook slightly as he carried the food back toward the alley, his chest tight with emotion. Staying out of sight, he placed the bag near where Ryan sat and walked away without a word, fighting the urge to look back. The smell of warm food reached Ryan, making his stomach clench painfully. He stared at the bag, suspicious and angry, his mind racing with questions about who had left it and why. His pride screamed at him to ignore it, but hunger won out. He grabbed the bag quickly, checking inside. Fresh burritos and coffee, still hot and steaming in the cold morning air. Ryan's throat tightened as he took the first bite. The food was good, really good. Not scraps or leftovers, but actual breakfast meant for someone who mattered. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, while his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. The warmth spread through his body, making him realize just how cold he'd been. The fighting men had moved on, leaving their bottle behind in a puddle of dirty water. The old woman continued her methodical search through the trash, humming tunelessly to herself now. But Ryan barely noticed them now, lost in thought as he finished the last of the coffee, letting the warm cup thaw his frozen fingers. Someone had bought him food, real food, and asked for nothing in return. The unfamiliar feeling of being cared for, even in this small way, left him more unsettled than any threat these streets could offer. It was easier to deal with danger than kindness. The evening shadows stretched long across the alley as Richard approached, his footsteps echoing softly against the brick walls. Steam rose from a nearby manhole, creating an eerie fog in the dim light. The acrid smell of garbage and decay hung thick in the air, a familiar backdrop to these increasingly frequent encounters. Ryan sat propped against a rusty dumpster, his shoulders hunched against the cold, watching as Richard carefully set down a brown paper bag a few feet away. "Seriously? You think leaving food is going to change anything?" Ryan's voice was rough with anger and exhaustion, his fingers curled into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. A muscle twitched in his jaw as he glared up at the man who claimed to be his father. Richard straightened up slowly, his expression calm despite Ryan's hostility. The smell of fresh sandwiches and hot soup wafted from the bag between them, a stark contrast to the alley's musty odors. His carefully pressed suit looked out of place among the scattered trash and graffiti-covered walls. Ryan pushed himself up, wincing slightly as his stitches pulled. In 2 quick strides, he snatched up the bag and hurled it at Richard's feet. The contents spilled across the dirty concrete, soup spreading in a warm puddle. The plastic container cracked on impact, sending chunks of vegetables and noodles skittering across the ground. "I don't need charity," Ryan growled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. His eyes blazed with a mixture of pride and pain, challenging Richard to argue back. The threadbare hoodie he wore did little to hide how thin he'd become. But Richard didn't rise to the bait. He simply shrugged, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Fine. Starve." The words carried no anger, just a clinical detachment that somehow cut deeper than any show of emotion would have. The words hung in the air between them. Ryan opened his mouth to fire back with another angry retort, but nothing came out. For the first time since their encounters began, he found himself without a sharp response. The quiet certainty in Richard's voice had knocked him off balance. Richard turned away, his expensive shoes crunching over broken glass as he walked toward the alley's entrance. His silhouette was dark against the streetlights beyond, growing smaller with each step. The steady, unhurried pace of his departure felt like its own kind of statement. Ryan stood frozen, his chest heaving with emotions he couldn't name. The spilled food at his feet seemed to mock him, and his empty stomach twisted painfully. The anger that usually burned so bright inside him flickered uncertainly, like a candle flame in a strong wind. He watched Richard disappear around the corner, waiting several long minutes to make sure he was truly gone. Finally, when the alley was silent except for distant traffic and his own breathing, Ryan knelt down. His hands shook slightly as he gathered what remained of the food, salvaging what he could from the mess. Each movement was careful, deliberate, as if he could preserve some dignity in the act. Settling back against the dumpster, Ryan unwrapped a slightly squashed sandwich. Each bite felt like swallowing his pride, but hunger won out over stubbornness. He ate slowly, trying not to think about why this stranger kept coming back, why he wouldn't give up like everyone else had. The bread was still fresh, the meat still warm, evidence of how much thought had gone into the meal. The food filled his empty stomach but left him with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't shake. He hated accepting help, hated needing it, hated that this man, this doctor with his expensive clothes and perfect life, kept showing up when Ryan had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. The worst part was the nagging voice in his head, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about that all along. The bell above the diner door chimed as Ryan stepped inside, his worn boots scuffing against the checkered linoleum floor. The smell of cheap coffee and greasy food hung heavy in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of yesterday's cigarette smoke. He spotted Richard already sitting in a booth near the window, steam rising from his coffee cup, his pressed shirt a stark contrast to the worn-down surroundings. Ryan's jaw clenched as he slid into the opposite seat, arms immediately crossing over his chest. The vinyl cushion squeaked beneath him, its red surface cracked and patched with duct tape. He kept his eyes fixed on the scratched tabletop, avoiding Richard's careful gaze. A nearby jukebox played an old country song, the twangy melody barely audible over the clinking of dishes from the kitchen. "Order whatever you want," Richard said, his voice gentle but not patronizing. He pushed the laminated menu closer to Ryan's side of the table. A tired-looking waitress approached, her pen poised over a small notepad, her name tag reading Betty in faded letters. "Coffee?" she asked. Ryan shrugged. "Yeah, and pancakes." His voice was barely above a mumble. He picked at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve, anything to keep his hands busy. The silence stretched between them as they waited for the food. Richard sipped his coffee, while Ryan stared out the window at the passing traffic, his shoulders tense. Morning sunlight filtered through the slightly dusty glass, casting long shadows across their table. "How long were you in the system?" Richard finally asked, keeping his tone neutral, his surgeon's hands wrapped carefully around the white ceramic mug. Ryan's laugh was sharp and bitter. "What, writing a book?" He shook his head, jaw working. "Foster care's just a fancy word for being unwanted." The words came out harder than he'd intended, but he couldn't seem to soften them. Richard didn't respond, didn't push. He just waited, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, the steam creating shifting patterns in the air between them. Maybe it was the warmth of the diner, or the fact that Richard wasn't trying to force conversation, but Ryan found words spilling out anyway. "Moved around a lot. 7 homes by the time I was 12. He stabbed at his pancakes when they arrived, drowning them in syrup. Last one wasn't so bad, until they had their own kid. His fork scraped against the plate with each bite. Richard listened, his face carefully composed. No pity, no judgment, just attention. It was unsettling. Ryan was used to people either ignoring him completely or looking at him with that awful mixture of disgust and sympathy. The morning rush had started to fill the diner, the buzz of conversation providing a buffer against the weight of his words. "Spent my 16th birthday in a shelter," Ryan continued, surprising himself. "Better than the streets, I guess. At least until some kid stole my shoes while I was sleeping." He traced a coffee stain on the table with his finger, remembering the cold floor against his socked feet. The waitress refilled their cups, her presence momentarily breaking the strange spell that had settled over their booth. Ryan fell silent, suddenly aware of how much he'd revealed. The coffee was bitter and strong, grounding him in the present moment. Richard still hadn't said a word, hadn't tried to offer advice or empty comfort. He just sat there, listening, present in a way that made Ryan's chest feel tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The morning light had shifted, warming the side of his face. As they finished their meals, Ryan stared into his coffee cup, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I don't get why you're doing this." Richard set down his fork, his response simple but heavy with meaning. "Maybe because I should have done it a long time ago." Ryan's hand tightened around his cup, but he remained in his seat, the words hanging between them in the diner's fluorescent light. Outside, a city bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes squealing against the morning quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Ryan sat across from Richard in the nearly empty diner. Their coffee cups had grown cold, half drunk and forgotten on the scratched formica table. Ryan's shoulders weren't as tense as they'd been during their first meal together, and he'd even managed a few short answers about his day, each word a small victory in Richard's mind. Richard watched him, taking in details he'd missed before, the way Ryan's eyebrows furrowed when he concentrated, just like Anna's used to, the slight tilt of his head when he was skeptical, a mirror of Richard's own mannerism, the crescent-shaped birthmark peeking out from his collar, identical to the one Richard had memorized in those few precious moments he'd held his newborn son. Each similarity felt like a punch to his gut, a reminder of everything he'd thrown away. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "You're my son." The clatter of dishes from the kitchen seemed to fade away. The whole diner fell into a strange, suspended silence, as if time itself had stopped. Ryan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, a piece of meatloaf dangling forgotten. His face went completely blank, unreadable like a shuttered window. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his fork to his plate. The small clink it made seemed deafening in the quiet booth. "What?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through steel. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing in his ears. His palms felt sweaty where they rested on the table, but he forced himself to meet Ryan's increasingly hostile stare. "I gave you up 28 years ago." He swallowed hard, his throat tight with decades of regret. "And I've regretted it every day since." The shock on Ryan's face transformed into something darker, more volatile. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "You're lying." The words came out like ice, sharp and cold. "I'm not," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "Your mother's name was Anna Dawson. You were born at St. Mary's Hospital. You have that birthmark." "Shut up." Ryan's hands curled into fists on the table, his knuckles turning white. "Just shut up. I know it's a lot to take in." "A lot to take in?" Ryan's laugh was harsh, bitter, like broken glass. "You think you can just… What? Drop this bomb on me? Pretend you care now?" "I do care." "No!" Ryan suddenly stood up, his chair crashing backward onto the floor with a thunderous clatter. The few remaining diners jumped, turning to stare. A waitress froze mid-pour at a nearby table, coffee threatening to overflow the cup. "I don't know what sick game you're playing, but I'm not your damn son." Without another word, he stormed toward the exit, shouldering past a startled customer entering the diner. The bell above the door jangled violently as he shoved it open and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echo of his anger. Richard sat motionless in the booth, his son's empty plate and overturned chair the only evidence he'd been there at all. The meatloaf grew cold, untouched, like the 28 years that stretched between them. The neon diner sign cast alternating red and blue shadows across the wet sidewalk as Ryan stormed away, his footsteps echoing against brick buildings. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped barbed wire around his lungs and pulled it taut. 28 years of abandonment, of wondering why he wasn't good enough, crashed through him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in memories he'd fought so hard to bury. "Ryan, wait, just listen to me." Richard's voice carried down the empty street, desperate and pleading. Ryan's hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. The pain helped him focus, kept him from completely losing control. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. But when he heard Richard's footsteps getting closer, the rapid tap of expensive shoes on wet pavement, something inside him snapped. He spun around so fast that Richard stumbled backward. "You think you get to waltz into my life and fix everything?" Ryan's voice cracked with emotion, raw and jagged. "You think I need a father now? After all this time?" Richard held up his hands, his face pale in the streetlight, his usually confident demeanor crumbling. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Ryan shoved him hard, sending the older man stumbling back a step, his polished shoes scuffing against the wet concrete. "You left me. You threw me away like I was nothing." His voice rose with each word, echoing off the buildings around them like accusations. "Where the hell were you when I needed you? When I was scared? When I was alone?" The words hung in the cold night air between them, heavy as lead. Ryan's chest heaved as memories flooded back, nights spent crying himself to sleep in foster homes, watching other kids get adopted while he remained behind, learning the hard way that nobody wanted him. Each memory cut deeper than the last. Richard stood there, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For once, the brilliant surgeon had no response, no clever solution to fix this problem. His carefully maintained composure shattered in the face of his son's raw pain. "I was just a kid," Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper, raw with pain and decades of buried hurt. Just a scared kid who needed his father. He backed away, shaking his head, his shoulders hunched against the weight of it all. But you couldn't be bothered, could you? Your career was more important than your own flesh and blood. Ryan, Richard reached out, his hand trembling slightly, but Ryan jerked away from his touch as if it burned. Don't! Ryan's eyes blazed with fury and hurt, glistening in the neon light. Don't you dare try to touch me now. You lost that right 28 years ago when you walked away. Without another word, Ryan turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller in the darkness, shoulders rigid with tension. Richard stood rooted to the spot, watching his son disappear into the night. The street felt colder somehow, emptier, like all the warmth had been sucked away. For the first time since medical school, since making that terrible choice all those years ago, Richard felt completely and utterly powerless. The neon sign continued to buzz overhead, casting its harsh light on the empty sidewalk where his son had stood moments before. A car splashed through a puddle in the distance, its headlights briefly illuminating the mist of rain. All of Richard's medical knowledge, all his surgical skill, couldn't fix this wound. This wasn't a problem he could solve with steady hands and precise incisions. This was a hurt that went bone deep, carved into the very foundation of who they both were, and he had no idea how to heal it. Richard sat in his darkened living room, the only light coming from a small desk lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the glass of whiskey to his lips, the amber liquid burning his throat. On the coffee table before him, scattered papers told the story of a life he should have been part of but wasn't. The pristine leather sofa felt cold against his back, a stark reminder of the emptiness of his carefully curated life. 28 years, he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. 28 years of pain I caused. His eyes moved over the documents again, adoption papers that were never finalized, foster home reports filled with words like troubled and resistant to authority, juvenile detention records from when Ryan was 16. Each page was another knife in his heart, another reminder of his failure as a father. His fingers traced over the yellowed edges of the papers, touching the faded ink as if he could somehow reach through time and change what was written there. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second hammering home his isolation. It had been a week since Ryan stormed away from the diner, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Richard hadn't slept properly since then, his mind constantly replaying their last conversation, hearing Ryan's words echo in his head. You threw me away like I was nothing. The raw pain in his son's voice haunted his every waking moment. He reached for his phone again, his fingers automatically dialing another number from his list. Yes, this is Dr. Monroe. I'm calling about Ryan Dawson. Have you seen him? The shelter worker's response was the same as all the others. No, sorry, haven't seen anyone by that name. Each negative answer felt like another failure added to his growing collection. Richard hung up and marked another line through another number, his pen pressing so hard it nearly tore through the paper. His list of places to call was growing shorter, but Ryan remained missing. He'd driven past the alley where he'd first found Ryan after the hospital, checked the diner multiple times, even visited the rougher areas of town where homeless people gathered. Nothing. Each empty location left him feeling more desperate than the last. The foster care reports painted a brutal picture. Ryan had bounced between 7 different homes before he turned 12. Notes described him as withdrawn, defensive, shows signs of attachment disorder. One report mentioned him running away at age 15. Another detailed a fight that left him with 3 broken ribs. The clinical language couldn't hide the story of a child who'd learned early that the world was a cruel place. I found him, Richard muttered, draining his glass and wincing at the burn. I finally found him, and I lost him again. He stood up, pacing the room, his expensive shoes silent on the thick carpet. The contrast between his comfortable life and Ryan's struggle for survival wasn't lost on him. While he'd been building his career, earning accolades and living in luxury, his son had been fighting just to survive each day. The framed medical degrees on his wall seemed to mock him now, certificates of achievement that meant nothing compared to his greatest failure. More phone calls, more dead ends. The hospital hadn't seen him. The police had no reports. The shelters hadn't spotted him. It was like Ryan had vanished completely, and Richard felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on his shoulders. His normally steady surgeon's hands shook as he dialed number after number. He collapsed back into his chair, running a hand over his face. The room seemed to spin slightly, whether from exhaustion or the whiskey, he wasn't sure. Looking up at the ceiling, Richard finally voiced the question that had been haunting him for days. Did I just make everything worse? The empty room offered no answer, leaving him alone with his guilt and regret, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of wrong choices. Richard jerked awake on his couch, papers from Ryan's files sliding off his chest and scattering across the floor with a soft rustle. His neck ached fiercely from sleeping at an awkward angle, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. The room was dark except for the dim glow of his desk lamp still burning from earlier, casting long shadows across the walls. The phone rang again, cutting through the silence like a knife. Richard blinked hard, trying to clear his foggy mind. He'd been dreaming about Ryan, about the day he left the hospital, about their last conversation at the diner, about the hurt and anger in his son's eyes. The phone kept ringing, insistent and demanding. He fumbled around the coffee table, knocking over an empty coffee mug that rolled across the surface before his fingers found his cell phone. The screen showed an unknown number, its blue light harsh in the darkness. His heart skipped a beat as he answered, his fingers trembling slightly. "Dr. Monroe?" The voice was professional, measured, with an undercurrent of urgency. "Yes," he croaked, clearing his throat roughly. "This is Dr. Monroe. I'm calling from Metro General's emergency department. We have a patient here, a young man, found unconscious, stab wound." The nurse paused, her voice softening slightly. "No ID, but he matches the description you gave us 2 weeks ago." Richard sat bolt upright, suddenly wide awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hand started shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. "What's his condition?" "Critical but stable. They're prepping him for surgery now. Dr. Carter is on call." Richard was already on his feet, stumbling toward the door in the dim light. He grabbed his coat from the hook, nearly pulling it off the wall in his hurry, sending the other hangers clattering. "I'm on my way. Tell Dr. Carter to wait for me if possible. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He ended the call and shoved the phone in his pocket, patting himself down frantically for his keys. They weren't in his coat. Panic rose in his chest like a tide as he scanned the dim room, his breath coming in short bursts. There, on the kitchen counter glinting in the lamplight. He snatched them up, his fingers clumsy with urgency and fear. The night air hit him like a slap when he yanked open his front door, cold and sharp in his lungs. He didn't bother locking it behind him. Nothing else mattered now. His feet pounded down the steps to his car, each second feeling like an eternity, the concrete rough under his dress shoes. The car door creaked protestingly as he pulled it open and threw himself inside. His hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition, missing twice before finally sliding it home. Come on, he muttered through clenched teeth. The engine roared to life, and he backed out of his driveway so fast his tires squealed against the pavement, echoing in the quiet neighborhood. As he sped through the empty streets toward the hospital, his mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Was it really Ryan? How bad was the wound? Would he make it through surgery? But one thought kept pounding through his head like a drumbeat, drowning out all the others. I can't lose him again. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, watching the speedometer climb past the speed limit. Every red light felt like torture, every second wasted making his chest tighter. Every intersection was an obstacle between him and his son, between life and death. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar route to the hospital, muscle memory taking over while his thoughts spun wildly. The same hospital where he'd first discovered Ryan was his son, where their complicated story had begun. The same hospital Ryan had stormed out of, refusing help, his face twisted with distrust and pain. And now somehow Ryan was back there again, fighting for his life once more. while Richard raced through the dark streets, praying he wouldn't be too late this time. Richard burst through the emergency room doors, his heart thundering in his chest. The fluorescent light seemed too bright, too harsh, burning his tired eyes. His coat hung awkwardly, buttons mismatched from his rushed dressing, and his usually pristine appearance was disheveled. The night shift nurse looked up from her computer, her tired eyes meeting his panicked ones. "I'm looking for a young man," Richard managed between heavy breaths, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Stab wound. No ID. They just called me." "Are you family?" the nurse asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her expression professionally guarded. "I'm his father." The words felt strange on his tongue, both foreign and desperately true. He hadn't said them enough times yet for them to feel natural. The nurse studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. She stood up, grabbing a clipboard, the legs of her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Follow me." As they walked through the sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing off the walls, the nurse spoke in quiet, measured tones. He was found in an alley off 7th Street. Multiple stab wounds, the main one to the abdomen. A homeless woman called 911 when she found him unconscious. He was barely breathing when the paramedics arrived. Richard's hands curled into tight fists, his knuckles white. Someone had done this to his son. Someone had left him to die in an alley. Again. The thought made bile rise in his throat. They reached the trauma unit, and through the observation window, Richard finally saw him. Ryan lay motionless on the hospital bed, his skin almost as white as the sheets beneath him. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines, their steady beeping the only sign of life. A bag of blood hung from an IV stand, slowly dripping life back into his son's veins. A doctor in surgical scrubs approached, clipboard in hand, her face showing the weariness of a long night. "Doctor." "Monroe." "I'm Dr. Chen. We had to perform emergency surgery as soon as he arrived. He lost a significant amount of blood, but we've managed to stabilize him for now." "For now?" Richard's voice cracked, fear slicing through him like a knife. He could feel his professional demeanor crumbling, replaced by raw parental terror. Dr. Chen's expression remained carefully neutral. "It's touch and go at this point. The next 24 hours will be critical. We need to wait and see if his body can fight through the trauma." The knife missed his vital organs, but the blood loss was severe. Richard moved closer to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. His reflection stared back at him, haggard, scared, helpless. For the second time, his son was fighting for his life in this hospital. And just like before, there was nothing Richard could do but wait. The irony wasn't lost on him. A surgeon who saved lives daily, powerless to help his own son. "Don't you dare die on me, son," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "We've barely had a chance to begin." The harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU cast long shadows across the room as Richard sat slumped in the uncomfortable hospital chair. His wrinkled dress shirt hadn't been changed in 2 days, and dark circles hung under his eyes like bruises. The steady beep of the heart monitor had become his constant companion, marking each precious moment his son continued breathing, each sound a reminder that they still had time. Nurses had tried to convince him to go home, get some rest, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not again. Never again. He dozed off occasionally, head dropping to his chest, only to jerk awake at the slightest change in the monitor's rhythm. His back ached from the awkward position, but physical discomfort seemed meaningless compared to the weight of waiting. A small movement caught his attention. Richard's eyes snapped open, instantly alert, years of medical training kicking in automatically. Ryan's fingers twitched against the white hospital sheets, creating tiny ripples in the sterile fabric. His eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy pull of unconsciousness, like a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon. Richard leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he could hear it competing with the monitor's beeps. He watched, barely breathing, as Ryan's eyes slowly opened, blinking hazily at the ceiling tiles above, trying to bring the world into focus. "Ryan?" Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper, afraid to break whatever fragile moment was unfolding, afraid to shatter this precious instant of awakening. Ryan's head turned slightly on the pillow, his movements weak and careful, like each shift required immense effort. His face was still pale, dark circles under his eyes matching Richard's own. Recognition flickered across his features as his gaze settled on Richard, confusion giving way to awareness. "You're still here." The words were rough, scratchy from disuse, but they hit Richard like a physical blow. There was something in Ryan's tone, surprise, confusion, and maybe something else. Something that made Richard's chest tighten with equal parts hope and regret. Richard swallowed hard, his hands gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. "I never left." Ryan studied him for a long moment, his eyes moving over Richard's disheveled appearance, the clear signs that he hadn't moved from that spot. The empty coffee cups on the side table, the wrinkled jacket draped over the chair back. Something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. A crack in the wall he'd built so carefully around himself, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Don't make a big deal out of this, all right?" Ryan mumbled, his eyes already growing heavy again, fighting against exhaustion. Richard couldn't help the soft, relieved chuckle that escaped him. Too late. The words carried all the emotion he couldn't express, all the promises he intended to keep. The afternoon sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting thin stripes of light across Ryan's bed. The steady beep of monitors had become background noise now, almost peaceful compared to the chaos of the past few days. Ryan sat propped up against his pillows, his face still pale but with more color than before. His fingers absently picked at the edge of his blanket, a nervous habit he'd developed during his stay. Richard occupied the chair beside the bed, a paperback novel open in his lap. Though his eyes moved across the pages, he hadn't turned one in over 20 minutes. The leather of the chair creaked softly whenever he shifted. The silence between them felt different now, less hostile, more like the quiet between two people trying to figure out where they stand. Ryan shifted, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. A sharp intake of breath betrayed his discomfort. "You don't have to be here, you know." His voice was rough but steady, carrying an edge of his usual defiance. Without looking up from his book, Richard replied simply, "Yeah, I do." His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the book's cover. The answer hung in the air. Ryan's hands stilled on the blanket, and he stared at the bandages wrapped around his palms, evidence of defending himself in the attack. The afternoon light caught the old scars on his knuckles, telling stories of other fights, other struggles. Each mark was a chapter in a life lived too hard, too fast. "So..." Ryan's voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable, cracking slightly on the single syllable. "What now?" He kept his eyes fixed on his hands, as if afraid to see Richard's reaction, his shoulders hunched forward protectively. Richard carefully closed his book and set it aside. The spine was cracked and worn. He'd been carrying it around for days, barely reading a word. The pages were dog-eared from countless attempts to focus. He took his time answering, knowing the weight this moment carried, measuring each word carefully. "That depends on you," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. His hands clasped together in his lap, steady as they were in surgery. The machines beeped steadily in the background as Ryan processed these words. His jaw worked, like he was chewing over thoughts he couldn't quite voice. The defensive anger that had been his shield for so long was still there, but it seemed thinner now, worn down by exhaustion and maybe something else. A nurse passed by in the hallway, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Ryan stared out the window for a long moment before turning back to Richard. His eyes, so like his father's, held a mix of wariness and something that might have been hope. He studied Richard's face, as if searching for any sign of deception, any hint that this was just another disappointment waiting to happen. "Guess we'll see," he muttered finally. The words weren't much, but they weren't a rejection either. His fingers resumed their nervous movement on the blanket, but slower now, less agitated. For the first time since Richard had found him, Ryan was leaving a door open, even if just a crack. The afternoon sun continued its slow march across the room, marking the beginning of something neither of them could yet define. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of the physical therapy unit, highlighting dust motes in the air. Ryan's knuckles were white as he gripped the parallel bars, sweat beading on his forehead and trickling down his temples. His hospital gown hung loose on his frame, showing just how much weight he'd lost during his recovery. The thin cotton material did little to hide how his collarbones jutted out sharply. "That's it, nice and slow," the physical therapist encouraged, her voice gentle but firm. "Just take one step at a time. You're doing great." From his corner of the room, Richard watched silently, fighting the urge to rush forward and help. He could see the tremor in Ryan's arms, the way his jaw clenched with determination and frustration. Every muscle in Richard's body tensed in sympathy with his son's struggle. Ryan lifted his right foot, attempting to take a step forward. His legs shook with the effort, muscles quivering visibly, and suddenly his knee buckled. He stumbled, barely catching himself on the bars, his arms straining with the effort to keep himself upright. "Son of a..." Ryan's curse cut through the air as he tried to right himself. The physical therapist reached out to steady him, but he jerked away from her touch as if her hands were made of fire. "I got it," he snapped, his breathing heavy and ragged. "Just give me a minute." Beads of sweat dripped from his chin onto the floor. Richard took a careful step forward, keeping his voice neutral, measured. "No one's expecting you to do this overnight. Recovery takes time." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger and something deeper. Fear, maybe, or raw vulnerability. "Yeah? Well, I don't have time to be weak." His words came out sharp, bitter, like broken glass. "You think the streets care if I need time to recover?" Richard saw it then, the years of survival etched into every line of Ryan's face, aging him beyond his years. The necessity of always being strong, always being ready to run or fight. Never having the luxury of weakness, of letting his guard down even for a moment. The physical therapist tried again, her tone professional but sympathetic. "Mr. Dawson, perhaps we should take a break." "No," Ryan cut her off, his voice hard as steel. He shoved himself away from the bars, staggering slightly on unsteady legs. "This is stupid. I don't need this." Richard stayed where he was, not crowding, not pushing. He'd learned over the past week that pushing only made Ryan retreat further, like a wounded animal backing into a corner. Instead, he simply said, "You're right. The streets don't care. But you're not on them right now. You're safe here." Ryan's shoulders tensed at the words, muscles bunching beneath the thin hospital gown. For a moment, he stood there breathing hard, his back to both of them. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the door, squeaking wheels, muffled voices, the soft ding of an elevator. Finally, Ryan took a deep, frustrated breath. His hands found the bars again, gripping them with renewed determination, his knuckles blanching white with effort. This time, he didn't look at Richard or acknowledge his presence, but he didn't tell him to leave either, and in the tentative quiet of the room, that felt like the smallest of victories. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of the physical therapy unit, highlighting dust motes in the air. Ryan's knuckles were white as he gripped the parallel bars, sweat beading on his forehead. His hospital gown hung loose on his frame, showing just how much weight he'd lost during his recovery. "That's it, nice and slow," the physical therapist encouraged, her voice gentle but firm. "Just take one step at a time." From his corner of the room, Richard watched silently, fighting the urge to rush forward and help. He could see the tremor in Ryan's arms, the way his jaw clenched with determination and frustration. Ryan lifted his right foot, attempting to take a step forward. His legs shook with the effort, and suddenly his knee buckled. He stumbled, barely catching himself on the bars. "Son of a..." Ryan's curse cut through the air as he tried to right himself. The physical therapist reached out to steady him, but he jerked away from her touch. "I got it," he snapped, his breathing heavy. "Just give me a minute." Richard took a careful step forward, keeping his voice neutral. "No one's expecting you to do this overnight." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with anger and something deeper. Fear, maybe. Yeah? Well, I don't have time to be weak. His words came out sharp, bitter. You think the streets care if I need time to recover? Richard saw it then. The years of survival etched into every line of Ryan's face. The necessity of always being strong, always being ready to run or fight, never having the luxury of weakness. The physical therapist tried again. Mr. Dawson, perhaps we should take a break. No. Ryan cut her off, his voice hard. He shoved himself away from the bars, staggering slightly. This is stupid, I don't need this. Richard stayed where he was, not crowding, not pushing. He'd learned over the past week that pushing only made Ryan retreat further. Instead, he simply said, You're right. The streets don't care, but you're not on them right now. Ryan's shoulders tensed at the words. For a moment he stood there, breathing hard, his back to both of them. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and distant hospital sounds. Finally, Ryan took a deep, frustrated breath. Without looking at Richard or the therapist, he moved back to the parallel bars. His hands gripped the metal again, knuckles white with determination. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge either of them, but he also didn't tell them to leave. Richard remained in his corner, a silent presence, watching his son fight his own battles. The quiet of the hospital room pressed in around Ryan like a physical weight. The steady beep of monitors and the soft hum of medical equipment were the only sounds breaking the midnight silence. He shifted uncomfortably in the bed, his wounds aching, but the pain in his body was nothing compared to the chaos in his mind. Unable to find rest, Ryan pushed himself up to sitting position. His gaze drifted to the small mirror mounted near the sink. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast shadows across his face, making him look gaunt and haunted. He barely recognized the person staring back at him. The face in the mirror told a story, each scar, each hollow, each hardened line etched by years of survival. His eyes were dark pools of accumulated pain, reflecting back years of abandonment and struggle. Memories crashed over him like waves. He remembered huddling in doorways during winter storms, his stomach cramping with hunger. The bitter taste of pride as he refused to beg. The metallic tang of blood in his mouth after countless fights. The cold indifference of foster homes that never became real homes. His hands curled into tight fists, knuckles white with tension. Every shelter that turned him away, every person who looked through him like he was invisible. Every night he wondered if he'd wake up alive. It all swirled together into a tornado of anger and pain. Standing abruptly, Ryan approached the mirror. His reflection seemed to mock him. This broken version of himself. This person who couldn't even walk properly anymore. The weakness in his body felt like a betrayal after years of depending on nothing but his own strength. Maybe I was never meant to make it, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth he'd carried for years. Every near-death experience, every close call, every moment of desperation. Maybe they were all just delaying the inevitable. Something snapped inside him. His fist shot forward, connecting with the mirror. The glass splintered with a sharp crack, fragments tinkling to the floor. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through his hand, but he barely felt it. Blood welled up from his split knuckles, crimson drops falling silently to the pristine white floor. The shattered mirror now reflected back dozens of fractured versions of himself, broken, just like he felt inside. The room fell silent again, save for his ragged breathing. But in his head, in his heart, Ryan was screaming. The sound of his own despair echoed through the chambers of his mind, drowning out everything else. Richard stepped into Ryan's hospital room early that morning, his footsteps faltering as he took in the scene before him. Shards of broken mirror littered the floor, spots of dried blood marking the white tiles like accusations. His eyes moved to Ryan, who sat hunched on the bed, fresh bandages wrapped around both hands. So what? You gonna give me a lecture? Ryan's voice was rough, defensive, but underneath lay something fragile. Richard felt his jaw clench, watching his son avoid his gaze. Every instinct told him to react, to demand answers, to try fixing this like he fixed everything else. But he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. Years of medical training had taught him when to push and when to wait. No, he said quietly. "But I am going to ask you one thing." Ryan's eyes flickered toward him, suspicious and guarded. The morning light streaming through the window highlighted the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Richard took another breath, choosing his words carefully. "Do you want to live?" The question hung heavy in the air between them. Ryan's bandaged hands trembled slightly in his lap, but his voice remained steady when he finally answered. "I don't know." Those 3 words carried more honesty than anything Ryan had said before. No anger, no sarcasm, no walls, just raw truth. Richard nodded slowly, understanding the weight of that admission. "Then let's figure it out together." Ryan stared at him for a long moment, his usual defiance absent. For the first time since they'd met, he didn't fight back. He didn't argue or push Richard away. Instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, accepting the offered lifeline. Richard wheels Ryan's chair toward a quieter section of the hospital, where sunlight streams through tall windows. The afternoon light bathes everything in a warm glow, making the sterile hospital feel almost peaceful. Ryan's bandaged hands rest in his lap, his shoulders less tense than they've been in days. "It's weird, being in a hospital and not running from it," Ryan says, his eyes following people walking outside. A mother pushes a stroller. An elderly couple holds hands. Normal lives being lived. Richard settles into a chair beside him, sensing something different in Ryan's demeanor. The anger that usually radiates from him has softened, replaced by something more contemplative. They sit in silence for a few minutes, just watching the world go by. Finally, Ryan turns to look at Richard. His voice is quiet but steady. "Why did you leave?" Richard feels the weight of those 4 words. He takes a deep breath, knowing this moment demands absolute honesty. "Because I was a coward," he says simply. "Because I told myself I wasn't ready. Because I was selfish." Ryan's jaw tightens, but he doesn't lash out. Instead, he nods slowly, processing the words. "And now?" "Now," Richard says, meeting Ryan's gaze. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. If you let me." The words hang between them. Ryan looks back out the window, his expression unreadable. A nurse walks by, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Someone laughs down the hall. Life in the hospital goes on around them as they sit in this moment of truth. Ryan leans back in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on the sky outside. After what feels like forever, he speaks. "We'll see." It's not forgiveness. The words are still guarded, still careful. But for the first time, they don't carry the sharp edge of rejection. Instead, they hold something new, the smallest glimmer of possibility. The evening sun casts long shadows across Ryan's hospital room as Richard settles into the chair beside the bed. The steady beep of monitors fills the silence between them. Ryan's jaw is tight, his arms crossed defensively over his chest, but there's something different in his eyes tonight. A willingness to listen, even if it hurts. "All right, let's hear it," Ryan says, his voice low and controlled. "No excuses, no sugarcoating. Just tell me why you left." Richard feels the weight of 28 years pressing down on him. He leans forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and forces himself to meet Ryan's gaze. "I was 24, Richard begins, his voice rough with emotion. "Top of my class in medical school. I thought I had everything figured out." He pauses, remembering his younger self, ambitious, arrogant, terrified. "When your mother told me she was pregnant, all I could think about was how it would derail my plans." Ryan's fingers grip the bedsheets tighter, but he remains silent. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing," Richard continues. "I told myself you'd be better off without me, that someone else could give you the life you deserved." His voice cracks slightly. "I told myself so many things to make it okay." The memory of that day floods back, the hospital hallway, Anna's tears, his own cowardice disguised as practicality. "I chose my career over my son. I walked away because I was afraid of failing at being a father." Ryan's face remains carefully neutral, but his knuckles are white against the sheets. And now? Richard straightens in his chair, the full weight of his failures pressing down on him. Now, I know I was wrong. Completely wrong. Silence stretches between them. Ryan turns to look out the window, his profile sharp against the fading light. When he finally speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. You should have fought for me. Richard exhales slowly, feeling the truth of those words like a physical pain. I know. And I will now. If you let me. The late afternoon sun glints off nearby buildings as Richard's car winds through the city streets. Ryan sits rigid in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. His hospital discharge papers crinkle in his lap, but he hasn't looked at them once. Richard clears his throat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I found you an apartment. It's nothing fancy, but it's safe. You can stay there until you figure out what's next. Ryan's jaw tightens. I don't need your charity. This isn't charity, Richard says, trying to keep his voice steady. It's a chance to start over, to build something different. Different, Ryan scoffs. You think 4 walls and a roof are going to fix everything? No, but it's better than going back to the streets. Richard takes a deep breath. You deserve better than that. Don't. Ryan's voice turns sharp. Don't act like you know what I deserve. Then tell me what you want, Ryan. Because going back out there, Richard gestures at the grimy sidewalks they're passing. That's not living. That's surviving. Maybe that's all I'm meant to do. Ryan's words come out bitter. Stop the car. Ryan. I said stop the car. Ryan's fist slams against the dashboard. Richard pulls over to the curb, his heart pounding. Ryan unbuckles his seatbelt with shaking hands. You can't just waltz in here and try to fix everything, Ryan says, his voice rough. You don't get to play savior now. I'm not trying to be a savior, Richard says. I'm trying to be your father. Yeah? Well, you're about 28 years too late. Ryan pushes the car door open and steps out onto the sidewalk. Richard watches helplessly as Ryan stalks away, his shoulders hunched against the wind. I can't force you to want better, son, he calls out, but I hope you do. Ryan doesn't look back as he disappears around the corner, leaving Richard alone with his regret. Ryan's footsteps echo through the familiar back streets, past graffiti-covered walls and overflowing dumpsters. The bitter wind cuts through his thin jacket, but he barely registers the cold anymore. Everything looks the same crumbling buildings, the same shadowy corners. But something feels different. He passes Mike, an old regular at his usual sleeping spot, hunched under a ragged blanket. Mike raises a shaky hand in greeting, his eyes glazed and distant. Hey, street brother. Thought you disappeared. Ryan nods but keeps walking. The smell of urine and rotting garbage fills his nostrils, a smell he used to be numb to. Now it makes his stomach turn. Near the abandoned warehouse, he spots Jimmy and Carol huddled around a small fire in a trash can. Their faces are gaunt, bodies trembling as they pass a needle between them. Ryan watches, remembering countless nights just like this one. Suddenly, Jimmy's eyes roll back. His body goes rigid, then slumps to the ground. Carol screams, scrambling away in panic. Ryan stands frozen, his heart hammering. Every instinct tells him to walk away. That's the rule of the streets. Don't get involved. Don't draw attention. But his hand is already pulling out the phone Richard gave him. His fingers shake as he dials 911. There's an overdose, he says, his voice rough. Behind the warehouse on 8th Street. Hurry. He stays until the ambulance arrives, its red lights painting the alley walls. The paramedics work quickly, efficiently. They don't ask questions when Ryan steps back into the shadows. As the ambulance pulls away, its siren wailing into the distance, Ryan's chest feels tight. He looks around at the familiar alley, at the needles, the garbage, the desperate faces in the darkness. Is this really all I want for myself? The question escapes his lips in a whisper, hanging in the cold night air. For the first time, the streets don't feel like home anymore. They feel like a prison he never realized he was in. The cold night air bites at Ryan's skin as he leans against the rough brick wall, a crumpled piece of paper trembling in his calloused hands. The streetlight above flickers, casting uncertain shadows across Richard's hastily scrawled phone number. His fingers trace over the digits, worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. The distant sound of sirens echoes through the alley, reminding him of the overdose he witnessed earlier. That could have been him. That still could be him if he stays out here. The thought sends a chill through his body that has nothing to do with the cold. Ryan pulls out his battered phone, its screen cracked but still functional. Pride wars with desperation in his chest. Every fiber of his being screams at him to throw the number away, to prove he doesn't need anyone's help. But the memory of Richard's unwavering presence at the hospital keeps surfacing. The way he stayed, even when Ryan pushed him away. His thumb hovers over the keypad. One number at a time, he punches in the digits, each press feeling like a surrender and a victory all at once. The completed number stares back at him from the screen, daring him to press call. "This is stupid," he mutters to himself, but his finger doesn't move to delete the numbers. He takes a deep breath, then another. The cold air fills his lungs, clearing his head. Before he can talk himself out of it, he hits the call button. The ringing seems impossibly loud in the quiet alley. Once, twice, 3 times. Ryan's heart pounds against his ribs, and he almost hangs up. Then, "Hello?" Richard's voice comes through, heavy with sleep, but still clear. Ryan's throat closes up. Words stick like glue to his tongue. The silence stretches between them, filled with everything he can't say. Finally, he manages 2 words. "It's me." He hears Richard's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of movement. The silence that follows isn't awkward or tense. It's filled with understanding. Ryan swallows hard, his voice barely above a whisper but steady. "Can I come over?" There's no hesitation in Richard's response, just warmth and relief. "Yeah, son, anytime." Richard's hand trembles slightly as he reaches for the doorknob, his heart thundering in his chest. The familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway makes him pause, taking a deep breath to steady himself. When the knock finally comes, it's softer than he expected. He opens the door to find Ryan standing there, hands buried deep in his worn jacket pockets. Dark circles ring his eyes, and his shoulders are hunched forward defensively. But he's here. Actually here. "Hey," Ryan mutters, his gaze darting everywhere except Richard's face. "Hey," Richard responds, stepping aside to let him in. Ryan hesitates at the threshold before slowly entering the apartment. His eyes scan the space, taking in the pristine kitchen, the comfortable furniture, the wall of medical books. Everything about it speaks of stability, of permanence. It's a stark contrast to the life he's known. Richard watches as Ryan's fingers brush against the back of the couch, as if testing whether it's real. The silence between them feels heavy with unspoken words and years of absence. "You hungry?" Richard asks, keeping his voice casual, trying not to spook Ryan with too much emotion. Ryan shifts his weight from one foot to another, still not meeting Richard's eyes. "Yeah, I guess." Without another word, Richard moves to the kitchen and starts pulling ingredients from the fridge. The familiar routine of cooking helps calm his nerves. He can hear Ryan settling onto the couch behind him, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. For the first time, his son sits in his home, not as a patient, not as a stranger, but as something new, something undefined but full of possibility. As Richard prepares the meal, he steals glances at Ryan, who sits perfectly still, like he's afraid to disturb anything. The young man's eyes keep returning to the family photos on the wall, lingering on faces he doesn't know. When Richard finally sets a plate in front of Ryan, the food steaming and carefully arranged, Ryan picks up his fork with hesitation. He pauses, the utensil hovering over the plate. "This doesn't mean I'm staying," he says firmly, though there's a slight tremor in his voice. Richard allows himself a small smile. "You're here. That's enough for now?" Ryan stands at the living room window, his silhouette dark against the city lights below. His fingers trace invisible patterns on the glass, a habit he's developed over the past 2 weeks. Behind him, Richard pretends to read his medical journal, but his eyes keep drifting to his son's reflection. You keep expecting me to disappear, don't you? Ryan's voice breaks the comfortable silence, softer than usual. The question hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Richard looks up from his journal, carefully marking his place even though he hasn't read a single word. I guess I do, he admits quietly. In the corner of the room sits Ryan's old backpack, stuffed with everything he owns. It hasn't moved since he arrived, but Richard sees how Ryan's eyes drift to it throughout the day, like a safety net he's afraid to let go of. His running shoes stay by the front door, laced up and ready. Days pass in this careful dance. Richard makes breakfast, they share quiet meals, and Ryan drifts between his room and the living room like a cautious ghost. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things begin to change. First, it's the shoes. One morning, they're not by the door anymore. Richard finds them tucked away in Ryan's closet instead. Then it's the coffee mug, the same one Ryan uses every morning, now having its own spot in the kitchen cabinet. Richard watches these small changes with hope burning in his chest, but he doesn't comment. He knows pushing too hard could send Ryan running back to the streets. One evening, as they sit in their usual spots, Ryan by the window, Richard on the couch, Richard finally asks the question that's been on his mind. What are you so afraid of? Ryan's shoulders tense, but he doesn't turn around. The city lights flicker across his face as he struggles with the answer. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper, he admits that this won't last. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He wants to promise that it will, that he'll never leave again, but he knows empty promises won't heal 28 years of abandonment. Later that night, without a word, Ryan picks up his packed bag from the corner. Richard's heart nearly stops, but instead of heading for the door, Ryan carries it to his bedroom closet. The bag disappears inside, and Ryan closes the door with a soft click. Neither of them mentions it. But when Richard passes Ryan's room later, he notices the closet door is still firmly shut, and something in his chest finally begins to unwind. Richard's keys jangle as he unlocks his apartment door, exhausted from a long shift at the hospital. The moment he steps inside, he feels it. The emptiness. His heart sinks as his eyes scan the quiet living room. Ryan's usual spot on the couch is vacant. Ryan? His voice echoes through the empty space. No response. Richard's stomach tightens as he moves through the apartment, checking each room. The bathroom door stands open, no sign of Ryan. The guest bedroom, now Ryan's room, is empty, though his few belongings remain scattered about. Richard lets out a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew this might happen. They both knew it might happen. Ryan had been restless lately, pacing the apartment like a caged animal. Richard had seen the signs, but hoped. A knock at the door cuts through his spiraling thoughts. 3 quick raps. Familiar ones. Richard practically runs to the door, pulling it open to find Ryan standing there, hands shoved in his pockets, looking somewhat sheepish. I just went for a walk, Ryan mumbles, not meeting Richard's eyes. Needed some air. Richard steps aside wordlessly, letting him in. Relief floods through him, but he keeps his face neutral. Ryan seems different somehow, his shoulders less tense, his movements less guarded. They settle into their usual spots. Ryan on the couch, Richard in his armchair. The silence stretches between them, but it's not uncomfortable. Just waiting. Finally, Ryan speaks, his voice quiet but clear. I don't know how to do this. Be a son, or whatever. Richard considers his words carefully before responding. Then don't think of it like that. Just think of it as figuring things out. Together. Ryan absorbs this, and for the first time, he doesn't argue or push back. He just nods slightly, processing. After another moment, Ryan shifts on the couch, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. You got anything to eat? Richard smiles warmly. Yeah, son, I do. Steam rises from 2 plates of spaghetti as Richard and Ryan sit across from each other at the small dining table. The overhead light casts a warm glow, making the moment feel almost surreal after everything they've been through. Richard sprinkles parmesan on his pasta while Ryan twirls the noodles around his fork, both of them settling into a comfortable silence. "This is pretty good," Ryan says, taking another bite. His shoulders are relaxed, a stark contrast to the defensive posture he'd maintained for so long. Richard smiles, watching his son eat. "Thanks, it's your grandmother's recipe, actually." Ryan pauses mid-bite, absorbing this new piece of information about his family history. He doesn't tense up or pull away like he would have before. Instead, he just nods, continuing to eat. "She always added extra garlic," Richard continues, his voice soft with memory. "Used to drive the neighbors crazy with the smell." A small smile tugs at Ryan's lips. "Guess that explains why I like garlic bread so much." They share a quiet chuckle, and Richard notices how Ryan no longer flinches when their eyes meet. The walls between them have slowly crumbled, leaving something new in their place. "Son, could you pass the salt?" Richard asks, the words flowing naturally now. Ryan reaches for the shaker without hesitation, his movements easy and unhurried. There's no tension in his jaw, no flash of anger in his eyes at being called son. He simply hands over the salt, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The conversation drifts to simple things: the weather, a funny story from Richard's hospital shift, Ryan's thoughts on maybe getting his GED. Nothing earth-shattering, but each word builds another bridge between them. As they near the end of their meal, Ryan sets his fork down deliberately. His eyes find Richard's, holding his gaze with a steadiness that wasn't there before. The question comes quietly, but with purpose. "Why did you keep looking for me?" Richard reaches across the table, his voice steady and unwavering. "Because you're my son." If you enjoyed the story of Richard, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.